Please put your hands together and help me welcome my dear friend, Walter Naegle.
Thank you, Minister Scott, for inviting me to help you celebrate Black History Month here in Norristown. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Before I go any further, I should maybe gently correct a few things. I was Bayard Rustin's partner for the last 10 years of his life. As you can imagine, there was a considerable age difference between us. Bayard would be 103 now, and I am not there yet. So although I lived in the 60s, and I was very interested in and aware of what was going on in the civil rights movement, I was kind of a committed young Catholic, if you will, and very interested in the idea of nonviolence and resisting evil through love, and that was what I was seeing on the television every night when I came home from school, and that was what I was reading in the newspapers. So I became aware of Bayard Rustin very early in my high school years, but I didn't meet him until 1977. So those of you who have heard of him, and some of what was already said tonight, you know Bayard is the architect of the 1963 March on Washington, where Dr. King gave his most famous speech. But of course, at that point, Bayard was already 51 years old. And he didn't just kind of spring up from the ground to organize the March on Washington. He had a good 25, 26 years, even longer years of organizing, and then certainly after the march, another 25 years or so. So I want to talk to you tonight a little bit about his evolution as an activist. Someone who went from really being a very radical outsider. Didn't take a lot. He was a black man, he was a gay man, but then he had to throw on top of that a flirtation with the Young Communist League, being a Quaker, being a pacifist opposed to World War II. That was a lot of baggage for somebody back in those days. So, but somehow in 2013, I was at the White House accepting the Presidential Medal of Freedom from our great president in Bayard's memory. Now, while I wouldn't ever say that Bayard really became an insider, if you will, he certainly had access to the halls of power, and he certainly had tremendous influence on several presidents and the civil rights movement in general. So he never really gave up his radicalism so much, but he learned that really to make change, the majority of Americans, we're not radicals. So you have to learn how to give, you have to learn how to take, you have to learn how to compromise and bring lots of people together to work for the common good. And that was something that he learned as he evolved. Now his journey began in Westchester, Pennsylvania, not far from here. And Westchester, of course, is a northern town, no legal segregation, but I'm sure some of you know, and I can certainly confirm that in 1912, when Bayard Rustin was born, segregation was not on the law books, but it was the custom. Blacks lived pretty much in their own neighborhood. The elementary schools were segregated. Bayard went to a segregated school. He went to an integrated high school. So he was kind of getting mixed messages. The roots of his activism really came from his grandmother, Julia Davis Rustin, she herself was raised in a Quaker household. Her mother was a domestic in a very prominent Quaker family in Westchester, Pennsylvania. And Julia went to a Quaker school for a while when she was in elementary school. And even though she became a member of the AME Church when she married Jennifer Rustin, those Quaker values that had been instilled in her when she was very young stayed with her. She became a local activist. She was active, one of the founders of the local NAACP in Westchester. And she imparted in Bayard all of those values, standing up for what's right, believing in the brotherhood of all people, believing in racial equality, and going about fighting for these things nonviolently. using, if you will, love and truth as a force for creating reconciliation. So Bayard's activism really began when he was in high school in Westchester, Pennsylvania. He refused to sit in the whites-only section in the local Warner Theater. I mean, he didn't refuse. He refused to sit in the black section in the local Warner Theater, went down and sat in the white folk section, and was arrested, and was taken to jail, and sent out a plea for people of goodwill to contribute to his bail. And he got out because people took up a collection. That was really the beginning for him. At the same time, he was a star athlete. He was a brilliant intellect. He had a wonderful singing voice. A person of really, really great talent. But he couldn't get a college scholarship because he was African American. But Julia Davis went and pleaded with some folks to help get Bayard into college. And he did a year or two at Wilberforce, and then another year at Cheney College. And then he decided to go to New York City. That was really where, it was after the Harlem Renaissance, but it was really where activism was taking place. And when he got to New York, he became involved with three really tremendous influences on his life. A. Philip Randolph, the great black labor leader, A.J. Muste, who was a Christian pacifist, one of the founders of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, and Norman Thomas, who was a democratic socialist. Now, Bayard's work with the FOR, the FOR was basically a peace organization. He believed in fighting against war, working against war. Bayard was all for that, and he supported that mission. But he, along with a couple of other activists in the FOR, someone named James Farmer, that name may mean something to some of you, Bill Sutherland and George Hauser, they went to A.J. Muste and said, look, we're all against war, but we also believe that racial discrimination and racism is a form of violence, and we should stand up against that. And so they formed a group called the Committee on Racial Equality, which functioned within the FOR for a number of years and then later spun out and became known as the Congress of Racial Equality, which Jim Farmer later headed. We're talking about the 1940s here, though. And this small group of activists decided to go around, mostly in northern towns at that point, to test segregated seating patterns in restaurants, hotels, movie theaters, and they would put their lives on the line, if you will, such as some of the sit-in folks did in the 1960s, but we're talking, roughly 20 years earlier. They were doing this, they were getting arrested, they were going to jail, and they were counting on people of goodwill to come and bail them out. A group of them in 1947 decided to embark on something called the Journey of Reconciliation. The Supreme Court had ruled in 1946 in the Irene Morgan decision that segregated seating patterns in interstate travel was a violation of constitutional rights. And so a small group of activists from the FOR decided to go into the South to test this decision to see if it was being enforced. And originally, they were going to go all the way down into the Deep South, Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, and it was going to be men and women. But along the way, a decision was made that it was too dangerous to allow women to go, and that they would confine their protests to the Upper South, places like North Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky. So they set off in I think, April of 1947, and they would get on buses in North Carolina, places like that. Sometimes a black person would sit with a white partner in the front of the bus, or one of the white men would go and sit in the back of the bus, and they would test the reactions of the driver and the other riders on the bus. And Bayard was arrested in North Carolina and sentenced to 30 days on a chain gang. It was rough, the conditions were terrible, but he used that experience as an opportunity to write a piece which was called 22 Days on a Chain Gang. He was let off, I doubt that it was for good behavior, but for whatever reason they wanted to get him back out to the general public, so they let him off after 22 days. And he wrote an article which was serialized in the New York Post. And that really led to the temporary elimination of the chain gang in North Carolina. Now, at the same time that Bayard was involved with Musty and the FOR, he was really working very closely with A. Philip Randolph, the founder of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. And Randolph believed in peace, he also believed in nonviolence, but he was much more interested in economic justice, especially for African Americans. He knew that, even if we got rid of racism and we got rid of racial discrimination, there was still a whole job of making a living wage, getting an equal education, getting equal opportunity, access to hospitals, and that was really something that was going to come through economic uplift. So he aligned himself with the trade union movement because he felt that that was really what was going to lift the lot of African Americans. Bayard, because of his Quakerism and his Christian pacifism, refused to go into the army in World War II and was sentenced to 3 years in jail. And he used that time as an opportunity to organize. The jails in this country, they weren't segregated, but within the jails themselves, there were separate dining facilities. Black African Americans were not usually allowed to use the libraries. They had separate recreational facilities. And Bayard really felt that that was an injustice. And so he would draw up plans, go to the warden and talk to him about, well, why don't we try this experiment? Why don't we have a table or so in the dining room where people who want to sit together can sit together regardless of race. And of course the argument usually was, well, people sit by themselves because they don't want to be with other people. They just, they want to be with their own kind, as they used to say. And Bayard would say, well, why don't we test this out? Why don't we do an experiment? And he did. And of course there were people that were perfectly happy to sit together and associate with their friends. There were other people that didn't want to. And in the prison system, he continued this kind of activism and really became known as, I guess you could say, a troublemaker, if you will. Mm-hmm. So the prison system really took a toll on Bayard, but I think it's fair to say that he also took a toll on the prison system. They were very happy to have him released. Shortly after that experience, he went over to India. And it was really in India that he learned how to build large demonstrations. The Gandhian movement, Gandhi had already been assassinated when Bayard went to India. But the Gandhi movement was really responsible for the liberation of India from British colonialism. And they did it nonviolently. But they did it with thousands and sometimes hundreds of thousands of people demonstrating. Now, Bayard had organized demonstrations back here, but very often in the 1940s you were talking about 15 or 20 people. Not too many people wanted to get their heads beaten in and go to jail for a cause. But over in India, he learned how to strategically organize large groups of people. So when Rosa Parks sat down in 1955 in Montgomery, Bayard was really the one person in the African American community who had the hands-on experience. He had both the theoretical knowledge, but he also had the hands-on experience of organizing. And so he was dispatched to go down to Montgomery and meet with the very young Martin Luther King. Now, Dr. King himself had a theoretical knowledge of nonviolence. He had gone to seminary, he'd studied Gandhi's works, but he never actually had the experience of marching and being involved in a demonstration. He really came from, I would say, a fairly middle to upper middle class background. So Bayard was really the person that was able to impart to Dr. King the mechanics of organizing. How do you take this theory and put it on the ground, get people marching into the streets? And he really became an indispensable advisor to Dr. King. Now, as was mentioned earlier, Bayard was a gay man, and he wasn't ashamed about that. He was fairly open about that. But that was seen as a liability by some people in the movement. And to a certain degree it was. You know, being gay back in those days was not something that was looked upon with much favor. And people were discriminated against, people were fired from their jobs, people were afraid to be open about this. And so people really felt that having Dr. King associating with Bayard was going to kind of tarnish the movement, if you will. But at the same time, Bayard was so brilliant and had such talent in organizing that he really just couldn't be dismissed quite so easily. So he was called on to organize what really was Dr. King's first national platform, something called the Prayer Pilgrimage for Freedom, which took place in 1957 in Washington. I think there were about 10,000 people there. And in 58 and 59, he organized 2 youth marches for integrated schools. Then 1960 came along. Mr. Randolph had proposed that demonstrations against segregation and for civil rights be held at both the Democratic and the Republican conventions. Neither party was doing very much about civil rights, and Randolph felt that it was time to lift this up. And so he asked Bayard to organize demonstrations that would take place at both of these conventions during that summer. Well, it's not really clear to me who dispatched someone to do something about it. People have different theories, but it was someone, I think, from the Eisenhower administration that did not want these demonstrations to happen. And they called on, who was pretty much the most powerful, or one of the most powerful African Americans in the country at that time, Adam Clayton Powell. He was a reverend from Harlem, and he was a congressman, the only black congressman at that time, I think. And had been in Congress for quite a long time and had considerable power. And they called on Adam and said, look, we don't want these demonstrations to happen. You have to do something about it. And Adam went to Dr. King and said, if you don't call off these demonstrations, I'm going to go to the press and say that you and Bayard Rustin are having a love affair. Dr. King was terrified of that notion, which I can certainly understand. And so he fired Bayard from his staff at that time. And the demonstrations went on, but they were much smaller than they would have been. So then we get to 1963. The March on Washington. A. Philip Randolph had proposed the March on Washington in 1941. He formed something called the March on Washington movement. Randolph at that time was probably, I would say, the most powerful African American in the country. And he wanted President Roosevelt to desegregate the defense industries. Randolph was all about jobs and economic opportunity. We were in the middle of a war, and that's where a lot of the jobs were. But African Americans were not allowed to take a lot of those jobs. So Randolph decided to organize a march, which he was hoping for 10,000 people to march on Washington. When the president got word of this, he said, you know, this can't happen. You know, you have to call this march off. And he called Mr. Randolph to the White House. And Mr. Randolph, in his wonderful Shakespearean voice, which I will not even try to imitate, said, Mr. President, even if I wanted to call off the march, you know, the masses are on the move, and I couldn't do that. It was an example of brinksmanship, if you will. He said, if you issue an executive order opening up the defense industries to African Americans, you know, I'll call off the march. The president said, oh, you know, I can't do that. So Randolph stuck to his ground, and I don't know, a couple of weeks or so before the march was to happen, Roosevelt did issue Executive Order 8802, and the march was called off. That was an example of, I would say, nonviolent power, militant nonviolent action. But it also was a little bit of a lesson for Bayard. Bayard was still pretty young, and he was kind of radical still and disappointed that the march had been called off. So he kind of stomped out of Randolph's office and denounced him. Not totally unjustified, but his feeling was, well, yeah, it's fine to pass this executive order, but let's see if it's going to work. Let's see if it's going to happen. And I think in later years, in some ways he was proved right. We had the 1954 Brown Supreme Court decision. But how many years later was it? And still, I mean, I can tell you, New York has the most segregated school system in the country. Not by law, but because we have not integrated our communities the way we should. So sometimes you can put a law on the books, but it takes a long time to enact it. So as you all know, the March on Washington was a great success. And I think in terms of Bayard's evolution, it really made all the difference because, as our earlier speaker said, Strom Thurmond stood up there on the Senate floor and denounced Bayard. But this time the civil rights movement, the civil rights leaders, under the leadership of Mr. Randolph, refused to dismiss him. And they said, we have great confidence in his ability as an organizer, and we're going to stand by our men this time. And so really after that, all of those attempts to blackmail Bayard because of his sexuality, because of his radical politics, they just didn't hold water anymore. And in a sense, it kind of brought him more into the mainstream. Another thing he learned from the march, the '63 march originally was supposed to be a 2-day affair. Some people were going to chain themselves to the White House fence. People were going to go into Congress and sit in, stop the Congress from functioning. But in June of that year, President Kennedy proposed a civil rights bill. And he went to Randolph and the civil rights leaders and said, you can't have this march. Here I am trying to put forth a civil rights bill, and if you bring thousands or hundreds of thousands of people to Washington, it's going to interfere with getting the civil rights legislation passed. People were terrified. The idea of having thousands of people, especially African Americans, coming to Washington, people were scared. But they decided to go ahead with the march certainly because of Bayard, but he had a wonderful staff, many of whom were young people. It was a tremendously organized endeavor, if you will. They had great faith that this was not going to be something that was going to become in any way disruptive, violent, disorderly, anything like that. People in Washington were predicting riots. They pretty much closed the city down on that day. Certainly all the liquor stores were closed. Congress was dismissed. A lot of people left the city for the day. But as we all know, the march turned out to be a wonderful event, a peaceful event. And one that really, I think, convinced a lot of Americans to get behind the idea of civil rights legislation. There are vast areas of this country, very few African Americans living. Some places, people maybe never even met an African American. But with the march being televised, so that people all over the country could see, that these were people who were just seeking equal rights, seeking equal opportunity, and doing so in a peaceful way. I think it convinced a lot of people all over the country to get behind the civil rights legislation. So I think that was really a lesson for Bayard in that he knew that to really get things passed, you had to build a broad-based coalition. It's fine to be radical, especially when you're young. You don't want to compromise. But if you really want to make change, you have to appeal to the masses of the people. And most of us are not radical. Most of us are not willing to go to jail for our beliefs. But we are willing to write letters. We are willing to write to the Congress. We are willing to participate in marches. So he appealed to religious groups, labor unions, women's groups, community groups, civil rights organizations, of course, and all of them coalesced, and you ended up with about 250,000 people in Washington on that great day in 1963. So I think I'm going to close by saying that 2013 was really, the work I've been doing since Bayard died, but with the help of some wonderful books and a great documentary film called Brother Outsider, which I believe is streaming on pbs.org for free, at least during Black History Month. It'll give you a lot more of Bayard's story. A group of us really got together and started talking about the idea of a Medal of Freedom for Bayard. All of the 6 leaders from the so-called Big Six of the March on Washington, Mr. Randolph, Dr. King, Jim Farmer, Whitney Young, John Lewis, all of them had gotten a Medal of Freedom. All of them while they were alive, except of course for Dr. King. And we decided that Bayard, who had kind of been the perennial outsider, it was kind of time to pull him into this group. So we began kind of a behind-the-scenes campaign. Nobody's really quite sure how these things actually get done in Washington. But we had some powerful allies, among them John Lewis and Eleanor Holmes Norton, who worked with Bayard organizing the march when she was a young law student in the early 60s. And I got a call in August, just a few weeks before the 50th anniversary of the march, saying that this in fact was going to happen, and would I be able to come to Washington in November to receive the medal in Bayard's honor. Of course I said no. No, it was a great honor, of course, to be invited to do this, and I was one of the first LGBT partners to accept an award in memory of their late partner. Sally Wright's partner was also there that day, and she was the other. So I think I'd like to close if we could maybe just run a clip of our great presidents making a few remarks on that day.
Now, early in the morning, the day of the March on Washington, the National Mall was far from full, and some in the press were beginning to wonder if the event would be a failure. But the march's chief organizer, Bayard Rustin, didn't panic. As the story goes, he looked down at a piece of paper, looked back up, and reassured reporters that everything was right on schedule. The only thing those reporters didn't know was that the paper he was holding was blank. He didn't know how it was going to work out, but Bayard had an unshakable optimism, nerves of steel, and most importantly, a faith that if the cause is just and people are organized, nothing can stand in our way. For decades, this great leader, often at Dr. King's side, was denied his rightful place in history because he was openly gay. No medal can change that, but today we honor Bayard Rustin's memory by taking our place in his march towards true equality, no matter who we are or who we love.
So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention and for helping celebrate a native son of Pennsylvania. And I wish you the best for the rest of the month and the activities tomorrow over at the Dance Center. The Dance Center? Yes. Thank you so much.
Mr. Walter Naegle, ladies and gentlemen, all the way from New York City,